Hello and welcome to Talking Templars. Well, today we're going to find out what was it about the Knights Templar that scared the pants off their enemies. But first of all...
It wasn't just their haircuts.
It wasn't just their haircuts, though they had fearsome haircuts. But we're going to first of all just introduce ourselves. I'm TV historian Tony McMahon, and who are you?
I'm Dr. Steve Tibble. I write about the Crusades and the Templars and the other military orders.
And the important thing you have to understand here is that I entertain some of the conspiracy theories and more esoteric stuff, while you, Dr. Tibble...
I tend to be less impressed and less easily convinced, but I do love a good story. So we're up for a good debate here.
So it's not, he's not a no fun Tibble. He's happy to do a bit of You've
been talking to my mum again, haven't you, Tony?
So. He's happy to investigate or consider some of the more wild stuff about the Templars. But today we're going to look at why were they such a formidable fighting machine. You know about the Knights Templar. They were this incredible sight on the battlefield. So my first question to you, Dr. Tibble, as the academic expert in the room, is were they as incredible a fighting machine on the battlefield as people like to think?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Well, they were certainly focused on that. I mean, if you look at the other military orders, particularly the Hospitallers, you can see they're ferocious on the battlefield, but they do actually have a day job as well. They look after the poor, they look after the sick, and so on. The Templars have one focus, and that is to become the best fighting machine of Christendom. And I think to a very large extent, they succeeded.
I mean, let's just consider, first of all, I get the impression that when most knights, secular knights, non-religious knights went onto the battlefield, Sir Humphrey of Hampshire and Sir Hubert of York or whatever, they'd go on in their family finery, they'd look a kind of riot of colour, charging in their own particular way. I mean, of course, they were subject to, overall battle tactics and so on. But there's something about the Templars all turning up, dressed exactly the same, with this kind of branding. Is this something totally new and a bit scary?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think there's two big things you need to think about. And one is that your average knight fighting in Europe, really was fighting on a totally different level. They were fighting in penny packets. They very rarely met as armies. They weren't maneuvering. It was very much about individual weapon skills. It was a bit of a show-off thing. That's why they had to be colourful. They had to be distinctive. They were invested in looking different rather than the same. They were also fighting a very different kind of war. Warfare in Europe between different European states was very much along the lines of, change of management. We're talking like hostile takeovers. These are corporate things, really. They're not ideological, they're not religious based. It's really, one family fighting against another family. And because everybody is the same religion, they come from very similar cultures, there's a lot of give and take. There's much less murdering of prisoners and so on. Now that wouldn't necessarily filter down to, how you treat the peasants, but in many cases the peasants were kind of off limits anyway. They were there producing the goods for whoever won. So nobody was that motivated in completely, destroying society, because that was not in their interests. If you look at warfare in the Holy Land, it's a way different thing. You've got a really, I wouldn't want to overemphasize the clash of cultures, but they are different religions. The biggest cultural difference, though, is the difference between nomadic societies and sedentary ones. So in the Middle East, you've got waves of Turks coming through who are nomadic tribes, and they're ferociously good at warfare, but it's a very different kind of warfare. They're on small horses, they're nimble, they're archers, they're maneuverable, and they're fast. So warfare in the East is of a completely different order, and you can have the best European knight. You can have a guy who's great in a tournament come over to the East, and he won't last 10 minutes because he'll have a Turkish arrow in his throat, or that kind of stuff. It's a very asymmetrical kind of warfare. You've got heavy heavily armored, slow-moving European guys fighting these fast-moving, missile-armed nomadic guys, and they just, it's a very deadly form of warfare.
Do the Templars kind of match up to this? Because, I mean, they drill very heavily. I mean, they've got a particularly kind of Spartan existence. I mean, these guys, they're waking up first thing in the morning and they're praying the same amount as monks. They live by the monastic rules. So, first of all, they observe the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their rule book says, no fun, guys. You don't gamble. You don't run off with
floozes, no floozes, yes.
You know what other soldiers do. You don't gamble. You don't laugh. We read all your letters, etc.
Don't bathe.
You don't bathe, etc. And plus then you have these military drills. So you're basically either praying or doing military training. Now, when it comes to the battlefield and you're fighting these very scary people in the East, does that make a difference? Are the Templars matching up to the enemy?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, you have to think back to when was the last time that Europe had organised standing troops, really? I mean, it was probably when the last Roman legionary, sort of went back to head office. That was when the last standing armies disappeared for temporarily. Anyway, in the Middle Ages, you find, obviously you've got different systems of employing troops, but the key thing is that these are not standing armies. They're not professional. The Templars aren't professional in some senses of the word, but they really approximate to it, and they have a kind of a professional grounding in the art of war that is of a different order to the guys back in Europe. But the other thing they've got is they're immersed in the world of warfare and politics in the Middle East. So they are this kind of conduit. They are the ones who can survive on a Middle Eastern battleground, and they hopefully can tell their mates back in Europe enough about it to acclimatize them so that when they come over on crusade, they're not just dead meat, which without the Templars and the Hospitallers, a lot of them would be.
Ever wanted to know more about the history of the Knights Templar, from their origins through to the end, and a few of the conspiracy theories in between? Then buy the Knights Templar History and Mystery by Tony McMahon. It's available on Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets. Buy it to get a comprehensive look at the Knights Templar. It's funny you say that about the Romans. That did occur to me as well, that nobody had really seen anything like this. A kind of, people fighting in that kind of formation. I mean, they go for this wedge formation, but that kind of organised formation, all looking exactly the same.
Yeah.
The Romans used to terrify. Their we call them barbarians, but they would terrify their enemies, whether Persians or so-called barbarians in Europe, because of their rigorous discipline, their training. Didn't they used to say their training was like battles and their battles was like training, something like that?
True.
But the Templars really are harking back to that.
No, and actually you can see it's not a coincidence that they're a papal order. And if you look at what institutions survived the Roman Empire in the West, well, not much, but the papacy are the nearest approximation to that. And I think you can see the germs of this standing army right from the beginning of the Crusades, even before the recovery of Jerusalem. So when the guys the first crusade got to Jerusalem, they were already having a debate about what it was going to look like afterwards. Once we've captured it, guys, what are we going to do with this? And the answer for most of them was, we'll be off then. They're going back home. They're looking to catch up with the wife and kids. They haven't seen them in years, literally in years. So although you have this papally sort of organized violent pilgrimage out to the Middle East, it's basically just a one-off, unless you can persuade enough of the guys to hang around and form a standing army to defend these places that you've captured. And it was that kind of strategic need that created the military orders. And it's a very intellectually flexible hybrid where you can combine an embryonic chivalry, you can combine the military aspirations of the secular world with the spiritual aspirations and discipline. Because ironically, it was the papacy that had discipline. It was their monks that had discipline, not the armies. We associate armies with discipline now, but in reality, in those days, it was a much more of a religious thing. And it was that wonderful way of combining those very disparate sort of ideological components that made the Templars really, really powerful at what they did.
And that's an important thing, isn't it? The fact that you kind of think, well, how could chastity be appealing to a young man in any era, let alone the Middle Ages?
Yeah.
But it certainly focuses their mind. It must have created a kind of energy as well, something that needed to be unleashed in effectively in kind of religiously motivated violence on the battlefield. But the Templars kind of managed to bottle this masculine energy. Yeah. They with no distractions, utterly razor focused, and with maximum discipline. I mean, the Templars really are like the strictest boarding school you could imagine.
No, absolutely.
And a lot of those rules as well that apply. I'm intrigued to know, they had a rule book, the rule. How does this apply on the battlefield? With the kind of first in, last out. You must look after your comrades. Does it really work, the rule book on the battlefield?
No, absolutely. And it can be a bit daunting when you look at the rule, and it can look a bit boring as well, because it is, it's a series of rules. So, but actually, it's quite profound when you try to envisage what this looked like on the battlefield, and it really did work. And you have to imagine that they haven't got numbers on their side, so they're always going to be outnumbered. They're almost certainly going to be outmaneuvered because the enemy are on lighter horses and they're horse archers. The other thing that they are contending with is that they don't have a technological advantage. Everybody's got sharp, pointy things. And there is no inherent advantage. So the guys are having to try and create advantage from very little, and it's in the human spirit. Its advantage comes from discipline, from focus, from bravery, and from being able to act as a unit rather than as individuals. And the rule is part of making, is drumming that into them.
So let's kind of paint a picture then of the Templars on the battlefield. They're these kind of white-mantled knights who are on horseback with that distinctive red cross on their white mantles. There are others as well fighting with them. They have local auxiliaries, what we call the Turcopoles, who are local soldiers who understand how the enemy operate because they come from similar backgrounds often. And others as well. Would there have been Templar sergeants and others? Would there have been infantry?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what does a Templar presence on the battlefield look like?
If you look at a Templar army, I think it's very instructive, and it really shows that the Templars were not what we think of them as today. I mean, we're pretty obsessed with ethnicity at the moment, but a Templar army would have looked very different to sort of caricature. This is not Aryan nation stuff. These guys, the brothers were primarily European, but most of the people in a Templar army would have been either mixed race, Crusaders who'd been living out there and they have Arab wives, or they would have been local people. Most of the population of the Holy Land were still Christian. As you say, the Turcopoles were almost entirely local native Christians. So this would not have been what you would expect. There's certainly nothing racially divisive about it at all. I think it's always better to think of the Templar brothers as kind of the tip of the spear. Yeah, and that's literally true. When they're charging in a squadron, they would be the guys in front. They're the ones who are most heavily armed. They're more likely to power their way through. But the critical thing in a charge, and that the charge is the battle-winning technique of the Crusaders, is that it has to connect with the enemy. But once it connects, it has to have the power to push through and destroy. It's almost a one-shot weapon. Once your horse is blown, you can't just turn around and come back and do another 3 charges. It's not going to happen. So the tiny number of Templar knights have this problem of, how do we get that critical mass? And one of the ways they do it is they have successive lines, and the rule makes clear how that works. And you're absolutely right. They have what are called Turcopoles, who are more lightly armed, and they have bows and arrows, so they're mainly native Christians. We don't exactly know what they're composed of. They might have been some European mercenaries. They might have been what were called the Polani, which is basically guys who would have had some Europeans in their family, but also some Arabs or Armenians, and leading very, very happily integrated lives and communities. They had squires, which is, and actually even the word squire means a range of different things. A squire is everything from a real posh kid who's about, just a few months away from becoming a knight, or it could be, somebody at the bottom of the pile who's washing the pans for you. So there's a big range of different things there. And you also have sergeants who are basically, semi-professional guys as well, but they don't have the social standing, so they'd be slightly less heavily armed.
And the sergeants, they look different. They've got their black, it's a black mantle with a red cross, so you'd have been able to distinguish between the two. Just to get our heads around as well, the armor. I know there's I'm not a big militaria person, but the Knights Templar, basically the armor they wore and the equipment they had was all stipulated in detail in the rulebook.
Yes.
So and it changes though over time as technology changes, because remember the Templars exist for 200 years. So most notably the helmet goes from the kind of classic conical helmet with a nose guard to the kind of sugarloaf helmet that encases their head.
Yes.
The thing I find always incredible is, if you think about the Templars in the 12th century, they've got all this chainmail on, they've got padding underneath, because you don't wear chainmail next to your skin. Go and try it; it's not fun. and then basically they've got a lance, they've got a sword, they've got a Turkish mace, they've got their thing. Then they're supposed to charge into battle and fight, and it's very, very hot in the Middle East, and a lot of them were not going to be used to this temperature. I mean, one has to imagine that heat exhaustion and goodness knows what else must have taken a toll. I mean, I think about the Romans enduring this, but the medieval European soldier, how on earth they endured that is...
No, you're absolutely right, and that's where discipline kicks in. The fact that they are there the whole time, on horseback the whole time. A guy in Europe might, he'd be living on his farm, basically, pushing his peasants around 90% of the time, and then he might have to go and do a few things every now and then, but it's not terribly onerous. They're just sort of riding around and occasionally doing a bit of almost a big tournament, perhaps for their lord or whatever. Whereas over there, these were really, really tough guys. And that's true not just of the Templars, but everybody living in the East. This was warfare on the Eastern Front. And you find throughout the whole period, when guys in Europe would be just dabbling, they'd be amateurs compared to these guys, that, out in the East, you had to find you in the saddle till you were 60. And, 60 in medieval times is way different. These are people who haven't had healthcare or the nutrition that we've got, and even nowadays, a 60-year-old would not be welcomed into anything other than desperate army. But in those days, you're talking almost, like dog years, really. And so I think that the Templars were really elite troops, and you don't become elite troops other than by continual training and discipline and focus. And that is, the uniforms are an impressive visual indicator, but they're a visual indicator of a much deeper truth, which is that these are people who are all committed to a corporate activity rather than just showing off in front of their mates, how well they are, how great they are at weapons training.
Just a quick Templar ad break here to tell you all about Dr. Steve Tibble's book, Crusader Criminals, all about those who went a little bit rogue in the Holy Land, the interplay between criminality and crusading, some of the larger-than-life characters who did some very wicked and evil things on Crusade. So get your copy at Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets. And that was the thing, isn't it? Because it almost is like the first corporate brand. I mean, it's something that's recognisable, throughout in any battle. When the Templars have turned up, because they're unmistakable.
Yeah.
One thing that intrigues me, just looking, we won't go into specific battles because we'll cover that in other episodes. I mean, we'll just look at the kind of the battle tactics and so on. But I was intrigued when they turn up on the battlefield. Are they literally obeying their own orders? What's the chain of command? Because you get the feeling there's sometimes, there's one siege, I think it's the Siege of Ascalon, where they go off and they charge through a breach in the walls.
Yes.
And there's an inference from sources not sympathetic to the Templars that they were doing their own thing. So are they kind of operating under their own Grand Master and chain of command, or do they obey the wider chain of command?
Yeah.
I know that's a very geeky question, but it's something that's kind of intrigues me.
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, basically, that is one of the problems strategically in how they're deployed, is that their boss is the Pope. Their boss is not the King of Jerusalem or the Prince of Antioch or the Count of Edessa. So if you were to look at them on a battlefield, it's probably more realistic to see them as allies rather than just guys who are going to do as they're told. They're guys that need to be convinced that what they're doing is the right thing. But having said that, their job was to protect the Holy Land, and obviously there's a big convergence of interest between them and the secular authorities. But it does continually resonate as an issue. And you raised the interesting issue there of the Siege of Ascalon, 1153, and the rather weirdly cynical chronicle is the chronicle of William of Tyre, who didn't like the Templars at all, primarily, I think, because they were taking a lot of money out of his pockets, because he was part of the what we call the secular clergy, and they were taking a lot of tithes away from his coffers. So he had a cynical view of them. But even there, you look at what he's saying. He claims that the Templars charged in and then stopped everybody else coming to help them, and then were wiped out. I mean, which is actually, from a military perspective, absolutely crazy. And we know from a couple of other sources that it looks like the guys went through a small crack in the walls. It seems like about 50 of them managed to get in, fought their way into the town square. And clearly what they were trying to do, which is what normally happens, is if you get a break-in during a siege, it's normally game over. But for whatever reason, they didn't get the support they needed. The rest of the army didn't follow through. The Egyptians were able to close off that sort of gap in the walls very quickly, and the Templars were eventually wiped out. Now, so to me, it's just a bunch of brave guys doing the right thing and not getting the support they needed. But from William's perspective, it's interesting to see how you can twist that and put a negative spin on it. But I think all that shows is it's a visible manifestation of the tensions between the Templars and the secular,
Because he kind of infers that they were bound treasure hunting, and that because they came under papal authority, any treasure they found they could hold on to, and therefore they were just in it for the money. But as you say, I mean, if it is as you say that they didn't get the backup, it does kind of infer as well that a touch of treachery, that other parts of the Crusader army were not necessarily giving them the support. But then that also then raises the question, but was there enough communication before the battle that, it's all very well saying we didn't get the support, but then, of course, I mean, maybe we'll never know these things, but whether or not the Templars talked enough to others, or did they just go off and do their own thing and expect everybody to, because they were so kind of imbued with their own, marvelousness.
There is an element to that. There is an element of arrogance. But I think, if you look at Ascalon, it was an incredibly tough nut to crack. And the Templars almost did it. In fact, the city fell just a few days later, and it had been under assault from the Christian side for nearly half a century. So it was a full Egyptian military base with multiple layers of walls, really, really tough to take. And I think everybody would have been desperate to help them. But the Templars were too good. Actually, they were good enough to fight their way through. Nobody else did. And I think the Fatimid garrison were good to close the gap behind them. But it was one of those cases where, as usual, the Templars are very few in number. Even the master was with them. So they were wiped out to a man. That included the master of the Templars, because they were just half a company in a modern army. And the rest of the Crusader army just weren't butch enough or quick enough to get in there behind them. I don't think it was treachery, because our guys were in that army were desperate to take Ascalon.
And there's a story that kind of exemplifies the kind of insane courage of the Templars. It's much later on, one of the later Crusades, where King Louis, the Saint King of France, they're fighting in Egypt. And can't remember the name of the Grand Master off the top of my head, but he's lost an eye basically in one battle, and pretty much the next day he goes into battle again and is blinded in the other eye. Unfortunately, he's then killed because he basically can't see where he's going. But that kind of, to me, kind of sums up the complete mad courage of the Templars. It's almost, as you like to say sometimes, it's a bit Monty Python, oh, you've chopped my leg off, have you? Well, come back here, I'm going to take the other one off if you're not
absolutely. It partly, I think it just comes from believing your own propaganda, which you have to have an absurd level of self-belief to do what they did. So I totally get where it's coming from, but there are occasions where that just doesn't play in your favor. And there's one particular, what we call a battle, it's more a skirmish really, where I think it was 120 Crusader Knights, of whom 90 were Templars, were actually chasing up to 7,000 of Saladin's cavalry around the Holy Land. So you've got these 120 guys faced up against 7,000 good quality Turkish cavalry. And when they caught up with them, the Templar marshal said, "Ha, at last they've been delivered into our hands." And it's sort of, you have to admire the craziness of it, but it's not, it's not militarily sensible. And in fact, what happened was, against all the advice of the Master of the Hospitallers, who was with them as well, the Master of the Templars led the charge in, and all of the Christian troops were killed, ironically, bar the Templar, the Master of the Templars, and 2 or 3 of his other guys.
That's Gerard de Ridford, isn't it? No, we're going to have to do an episode on good and bad Grand Masters.
Naughty Gerard.
The Templars had good ones, but they also had some really, a couple of pretty questionable Grand Masters. But I think we're going to leave it there, because we could, as you can tell, we could just go on and on and on this. But if there's any questions or comments that you have, some of you may be from a military background yourself and interested to know more about Templar battle tactics, or you have your own views on how the Templars fought, then do share them. There's a lot of stuff that we didn't get to touch on, but we're going to unravel a lot of the history and mystery about the Templars in future episodes. So for now, I'm sad to say it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And non nobis domine.
Join us again next week for more Talking Templars.